Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins-Treworgy, also known as Baron of Sidious. And I'm going to be presenting to you today something I have not presented in a little while, which is a review of a novel in the Storyteller's Corner format. This will be a longer review, as I will be reading from the numerous notes that I jotted down as I was reading the book in question. And what is the book in question? It is Jonathan Franzen's 2010 novel, Freedom. Some quick preface notes. Knowing how much of a fan I am of the works of David Foster Wallace and my general tastes when I occasionally stray from genre fiction and lean more towards literary or realistic fiction, a colleague of mine recommended that I give Franzen's Freedom a try. To quote her, "You'll connect with Patty and Walter quickly," she said. Just read it. When I asked her why would I connect with them, she said, just read it. She also warned me that while I may connect with them, that she was curious to see if I would find them fully sympathetic. And I will say up front, she wasn't wrong about me connecting with Walter and or Patty, two of the main characters in the story. Because a few pages in, I connected with Patty, because like her, I was born and raised in New York State and moved out here to Minnesota as an adult, much as Patty did in this novel. Also, like the character of Patty in the opening pages, I try to withhold immediate judgments of people, but we'll see if that remains a sympathetic note toward this character. Now, for a quick technical note, and this is important because this is to do with where I'm at as I'm reading these notes in relation to the actual physical book. I read this book on my Kindle, and I utilized a display size and spacing that rendered the page numbers different than the actual physical count of the original hardcover novel. The original hardcover novel was 576 pages long. And because I was using a kind of 3-to-1 scale or ratio on my Kindle, it was approximately a 3 screens to 1 page ratio. So when I read off a page number, as I've got it noted down in my notebook here, it's important to know that I'm actually reading on a 3-to-1 ratio, meaning for every 3 pages digitally, there's 1 page physically. So basically, take what page number I'm reading, divide it by 3, roughly. Anyway, on into reading point by point the notes that I took down. Pages 33 through 35. Patty Berglund is effectively characterized throughout this stretch of the book, the overly doting mother upon her son Joey, while Walter, her husband and provider, is illustrated by proxy as being an old-fashioned sort of disciplinary father type at this point in the story. It's a fairly traditional family dynamic, kind of scored off by their old, and it's scored off but juxtaposed by some of their ultra-liberal Minnesotan neighbors and acquaintances. To that point, Seth and Mary, neighbors of theirs, sport a fundamentally accurate Midwestern passive-aggressiveness that I find both endearing due to its accuracy, yet also revolting because of its accuracy. Many folks here out in the Midwest are only performatively pleasant to people. Get them behind closed doors and they say some pretty vicious, poisonous stuff. By page 47, young Joey Berglund strikes me as a budding narcissistic kind of almost sociopath in waiting. Not a great note toward his character. And Joey Berglund is Patty and Walter's son. Page 64 and 65. Holy God, Patty Berglund is the epitome in these pages of a Karen. But there's a kind of hectoring here, a balance of she's a typical whiny, privileged white shitlib, and she's a bored, over-opinionated tradwife. There's a balance there, which is intriguing to find this blend of character type in a book from 2010, the year of Occupy Wall Street. It's interesting to have a character presented this way, published in that year. And page 85 ends the first section of the book. My impression of the story at that point. The early portion of this novel reads as a sort of skimming summary of a much grander narrative, which it turns out to be. One whose chief players are introduced and all fall into some classic character archetypes. Franzen's depiction of Carol Monahan and her eventual beau, Blake, as pseudo-hicks of low class and taste, has a hint of disdain threaded through it, as though their less than liberal socio-political views somehow automatically renders them as bad people by default. There's clearly more to these folks, but I doubt that Franzen would divulge that point to his readers. There's definitely a tone here from the author, and it's foisted upon his primary cast throughout the story, and we'll see that as it goes. Paddy's autobiography portion of the book. This is an interesting tactic, to have this character autobiographize. More so, it's the way that she breaks down her own narrative into structured steeples that I found interesting. Next note. There is in Paddy's chapter 1, which she titled Agreeableness, a brutally cutting depiction of her familial elders. Of particular note is her mother's father, an obvious lech and possible groomer. To quote from the book, how Paddy thought of him, quote, he purchased an acceptance for his private eccentricities and perversions by means of being involved heavily in public good works. There is heavy emphasis on her mother being involved in Democratic Party politics and insinuating a kind of grubbiness as a result of that connection and being involved in that sphere of influence. Paddy's mother, Joyce, seems utterly disconnected from Paddy in her youth, since Paddy is kind of a black sheep amongst her sisters, being athletic and physically adept and involved in sports, rather than being dainty and artistic. My next note. Okay, just what the actual fuck? Set against the backdrop of her family's social and political station. Heavy note. There's some unpleasant material here that we're going to be touching upon, subject matter, but it's in the book. Paddy's rape at the age of 17 at the hands of a scion of a politically influential and connected family, the Posts, and her victimization at the hands of Ethan Post. Paddy's character is, in totality, somewhat confused for me, because her mother Joyce is revealed to be a completely craven political creature of her times, the 1970s, and her environment, Westchester muckety-muck influential political circles. Her response to Paddy revealing to her that the rape happened seems more concerned with the possible consequences socially for her, vis-a-vis her connection to Dr. and Mrs. Post, as she calls them, than what damage has been wreaked upon her oddball daughter's psyche and physical person. And Paddy's father, a lawyer of completely dubious scruples and ethics, so long as his political image is sustained as a bleeding heart liberal, is absolutely no help to her, though his response seems at least grounded in the awful utilitarianism of, I believe you, but we'll never win that battle in court, so let's just minimize our total losses. It's brutal, it's disheartening, but sadly, it's also possibly the most realistic outcome of all, given the framework, the setting. Franzen conveys this in a haunting manner, but it doesn't make any of these characters relatable or likable for me. It just makes them horrific. It's no surprise, however, really, that the accomplished young basketball player accepted a spot at Minnesota State University halfway across the country. There's even a bit early in Chapter 2 where Joyce chides Patty for the, quote, low reputation by comparison to Vanderbilt or Northwestern, competing schools that had courted Patty for recruitment. But Patty, knowing her mother had connections at those schools through political circles, and that they would lend prestige to Joyce by proxy, Patty said, no thanks, it's Minnesota for me. Quite frankly, this was a believable response, and it's one of the last points in the story where Patty is a character that I can feel any connection to. In the second part of this autobiography section, Best Friends, it's subtitled, page 147, in Patty's reaction to personal compliments, quote, compliments were like a beverage I was unconsciously smart enough to deny myself, even one drop of, because my thirst for them was infinite. Given the picture that chapter, that's a haunting passage. I love that line. Powerful. Given the picture that Chapter 1 of this autobiographical section of the book painted of her upbringing and her oddment amongst her siblings, this arm's-length approach to her own parents during her development, this is a soul-burning kind of passage. Patty was starved for affection and praise of any sort, but it's understood, even by her at this point, that there's a dark allure, an addiction to such praise. When parents withhold affection, when siblings withhold familial relation, a child often turns out strange and slavishly devoted to anyone who pays them the slightest bit of attention later on. And Franzen clearly understands the psychological development and correlations here. Next point, page 155. There's a brilliant quote here, one echoed a few times in his day by David Foster Wallace when referring to tennis, by retired NFL running back Brian Westbrook as well. Success at sports is the province of the almost empty head, unquote, from the book. In the case of Patty, Brian Westbrook, and David Foster Wallace, these folks were posing this not as any kind of bagging on or insulting the intellectual capacities of the athletically talented or inclined. They're pointing out that in the act of sport, the athlete tends to block out or shut out all other elements of life as superfluous to what they're doing at that moment. They are, as it were, Zen. They're absolutely, unarguably in that moment and of that moment. All else is senseless noise in their world. I had a smiled bit of annoyance at Patty's middle sister Abigail having such a condescension towards Minnesota, but it was a realistic kind of attitude that seems to stem from coastal elite types. Now, let's take a look at page 238, taking a quick hop aside to highlight this intense best friend, Eliza. This girl is a narcissistic leech, love-bombing Patty so hard that the young woman's emotional landscape was like London during the Blitz. It's not shocking that Patty is susceptible to her. From the way Eliza is described by Patty, Eliza was the late 70s punker or artsy sort, a little younger than Patty, almost like Patty's younger sister, who, mocked and belittled Patty. But instead, Eliza adores her openly, unlike the little sister. Halfway across the country from all that she knew growing up and now in college, so focused on athletics and surrounded mostly by jocks, Franzen masterfully plays Patty's character into expressing a realistic psychological trapping here. Patty is coping from her familial detachment by allowing herself to be close to this caustic little narcissist in Eliza. But there's a fascinating and infuriating turn in the second half of this second chapter of Patty's, because it brings readers along to see how much Patty, for all of her complaints and megrims about Eliza, Patty became something akin to that damned young woman with Walter. Walter is what in modern parlance would be dubbed a complete simp for Patty. And Patty couldn't care less, as she is just lusting after Walter's friend and then roommate, Richard Katz. For his part, Richard at least puts up his own defenses against her, so much so that only after he has ruined her chances of making it back to New York City in time for a family gathering does Patty relent and turn to Walter. But this whole section made me deeply dislike her because it effectively renders Patty as the epitome of hypergamous, trashy nonsense. My next note here comes in Patty's third chapter of autobiography, which she entitles Free Markets Foster Competition. My previous note about her being kind of a hypergamous trash bitch was further cemented for me on page 333, and again, bear in mind the translation because of Kindle display, that it's actually page 111, roughly. Regarding Walter, she says, he may not have been exactly what Patty wanted in a man, but he was unsurpassable in providing the rabid fandom which, at the time, Patty needed even more than romance. I mean, she's kind of an unreliable and hesitant narrator at a few points that come along after this point. And it should not be lost on readers that she wrote this section upon suggestion of a therapist. But she is starting to see in hindsight that she made some mistakes in judgment in her younger years. But she still puts down this kind of protective shield for herself to excuse how much she was dragging Walter down in her own head, and how she used him as a living, sentient rebuke of her own family and her upbringing. This makes her an almost incalculably unlikable person. Now, I have an instinct, and it's a human instinct, and it's understandable, though there are folks who would dismiss it in an attempt to seem sophisticated and broad-minded, that if you, as a reader, find yourself desiring that bad people suffer a bad consequence or a bad end, that you're being childish, or that you should go watch The Magic School Bus, or read Blue's Clues, watch Blue's Clues, or read Magic School Bus if you want to be spoon-fed this kind of saccharine, sweet, black and white, good and evil dichotomy. And there are plenty of people, even on what my favorite platform, Substack, there are plenty of folks who apparently feel that in order to show any kind of mature reading comprehension and ability to think outside the box, or to be capable of deeper thought, that you have to reject simple dichotomies at all turns. And that if somebody is an awful person, that you have to try and lend some kind of understanding. Look, there are times when you really can't excuse a person's shitty behavior. And again, I understand that Patty had a pretty terrible upbringing, and the apex of her young adulthood, before even transitioning from high school to college, she was victimized. These things can explain to us her future behavior, but an explanation is not an excuse. And wrapping yourself in what happened to you in the past as a defense against your own shitty behavior, it's not justifiable. It doesn't make you a decent or empathetic human being. It makes you incapable of rising above your circumstances. My next note comes from page 339. Let's see. Patty was actually right about her earlier self-flagellation, how she often found herself thinking she was not a good or a nice person. And Walter is kind of a 1970s Minnesota Job, with Richard and Patty being his curses. My next note, on page 343 through 344, whoa, buddy, Walter comes across to me in this reading as a raging progressive/leftist goober and hack. Jonathan Franzen has painted him as the penultimate soy boy already intellectually and tried to cast him as a sympathetic person when dropped by the uber-selfish Patty. But by God, he's a beta bitch boy. He is a simp for her of the highest order. But it did lead me to question at this point, was Franzen actually trying to critique these outlooks of Walter's? While that certainly might be possible, I have watched enough of Franzen's interviews and lectures to appreciate that no, he is not critiquing these worldviews. These are stances he himself personally stands by. It's one of those rare instances where, again, I might benefit from not knowing more about the author on a personal level. If I didn't know these things about Franzen, I could at least leave myself open to the option or the possibility that this is a critique of those worldviews. My next notes come from pages 418 to 421 in the display. In these pages, narrator Patty and or author Franzen deploy an intriguing little technique wherein Patty, in a showing of self-awareness, as she looks back over her execution of wifely and motherly duties and behaviors, provides a kind of one-person show, a back and forth, bare bones, prosecution versus defense argument, giving readers a fair amount of whiplash. It helps build character, certainly, but this particular reader cannot help but feel that it's gratuitously self-serving of Patty's perspective, and mildly condescending on Franzen's part. It's academic and intelligentsia fashioned, a kind of aren't I so clever, that smells a little of smug superiority, while leaving me with the impression that after so much time spent showing, Franzen now wants to tell for readers who haven't yet got it, quote-unquote, regarding Patty's nuanced yet irredeemable personality. She is, quite frankly, the worst sort of person to be attached to. Franzen's clear understanding of psychology, her trauma responses, her bonding and coping mechanisms, is impressive, yes. But it is therefore a shame that he seems to think so little of his audience. And so, next note in pages 478 through 479. At long last, Patty cheats on Walter with Richard and attempts to excuse herself for her unfaithfulness, going through all manner of self-defensive hoops to defend this betrayal. Frankly, at this point, I feel she's, well, a piece of shit. And Franzen, God bless his literary skill, he writes this selfishness so expertly that one could almost be sympathetic to her in her disgrace. But I'm a little appalled that his skill was used in making this tiresome, selfish twat almost understandable. Pages 482 and 483. Patty's self-pity and her obvious thrill in betraying her husband again the next day, the sick joy that she takes in having this spot on the living room wall that she was staring at as she was getting gorilla fucked by Richard, while Walter was away, it's just grotesque. Bravo to Franzen, again, in his skill in telling a story, sure, but I'm thoroughly disgusted by this character and narrator at this point, to the borderline that I might be tempted to set the book aside altogether. I mean, right now, what's the point of this story at this juncture? To illustrate the depravity that this woman is capable of in a permissive, uber-liberal worldview and lifestyle? Seriously, even the faint scorn against few religious ancillary characters throughout this story thus far is quite telling of Franzen's worldview. Now, it's not really Franzen's worldview, it's Patty's, but she is a character of fiction through whom he is choosing to relay this tale. The choices we make as storytellers have meaning. If it is meant as a critique, I might be willing to press on. And it is a big reason why I continued reading the book, because I wanted to see if there was any chance that perhaps this is all being portrayed the way it is from Patty's perspective, to demonstrate that that is not necessarily the way that everyone in the story views things. Pages or screens 530 through 34. Blissfully, Patty's autobiographical musings come to a close here, and really in an almost fitting decrescendo of exposure on her failure of personality. When Richard finally achieves success with his album Nameless Lake, Walter, Patty's husband, is mercilessly tortured by the success of a man whom he once saw as gifted but morally inferior to him. And she only sees in his response to it a kind of growing competitiveness that she had once known herself as a college athlete. Doubtless this is an aspect that she, in her well of self-pitying self-absorption, fails to recognize as almost entirely a sensation of her own creation. It would have been kinder to Walter and perhaps beneficial for her own life if she had not taken him on as her consolation prize partner when her end-of-college road trip didn't conclude with Richard hooking up with her, as she had been angling for in her younger days. Frankly, this feels like a waste of character. The next section of the book is entitled Mountaintop Removal. A few pages in, this is seemingly a third-person omniscient perspective portion showing Richard's perspective, kind of going from here forward chronologically, and it seems to be a telling of his fall out of fame and relevance. Page 554. Richard Katz truly is a piece of degenerate filth. Why is it that musicians, artists of any stripe or variety, really, are so frequently portrayed as womanizing trash? Historically, there's plenty of evidence that this is part of the archetype that surely does exist, one that's leaned into heavily, and with either intentional directive by the artists themselves or by dint of having to fill the God-shaped holes in their almost universally uber-liberal and progressive hearts. David Foster Wallace pegged it so well in his speech to Kenyon University. Quote, "In everyday adult life, there's no real thing as atheism. What there is the choice of what to worship." What Richard worships is music and his own place in its world, laying waste to every other facet of his personal life. For God's sakes, he's planning on nailing a high school girl because an 18-year-old kid at one of his deck-building jobs annoys him. This guy's an egomaniacal shit stain of a train wreck human being. This isn't nuance of character. This isn't the struggling artist with a beautifully complex spirit. This is Franzen practically glorifying people who abuse their personal freedoms and their freedom, the title of the book is at play here, because they can't handle not attaining their deepest desires. It's frankly pathetic. My next note, the interview with this 18-year-old kid. This scene is hard for me to weigh. It perfectly presents Richard Katz as the kind of self-aware irony merchant whom I deeply resent and detest. A hoi polloi, so full of his own cynicism and desire to come across as clever and deep, so given to huffing his own farts in pursuit of proving himself noble and philosophical, that it's almost impossible to avoid wondering if he might actually be sincere about it all. The problem, though? Well, he's doing all of this to be a cheap little rock edgelord, neither cute nor clever. He is, at this point, to me, a completely unsympathetic douche. There is a great line on page 568. The simplest definition of depression that he knew of, strongly disliking yourself. Like Patty, Franzen here seems to want to paint depressives as somehow deserving of readers' sympathies all the time, because the terrible damage that they cause in the lives of other people around them. They do that because of trauma, or it's beyond their control. Frankly, I sometimes have to say I call bullshit. Todd from BoJack Horseman had one of all of fiction's best responses to this kind of behavior. Stop. Just stop. You can't keep doing all of these bad things and apologizing for it because you feel bad. You have to be better. You are the reason you feel bad. Page 5, or screen 572, there's a bit of oddity here in this third-person omniscient narrative. According to these internal thoughts of Richard's, he had, quote, sacrificed his own pleasure and brutally disappointed Patty back during that road trip scene in order to preserve her marriage or her relationship. But he had taken that to mean that he had somehow risen momentarily to the level of Walter's excellence. But later on, obviously, he did not. So anyway, next note. In the dialogue ramble of Walter and his assistant Lalitha with Richard regarding the Warbler Conservancy project that they've been working tirelessly on, readers are finally able to get a look at Walter Berglund being passionate about something other than his feckless wife Patty. And it's a little intense. It's also pretty over-the-top propagandistic, exposing Walter as not just a nature conservationist, but blindly anti-natalist. It takes very little digging in on Richard's part to end up exposing that Walter and Lalitha's biggest concerns, what they blame most of the environmental damage in the world upon, and the malaise and changes in the world, is an expanding human populace. It's the same kind of misanthropic bilge that has been spewing out of the mouths of the most fringe environmentalists for countless years. I would argue that this dovetails perfectly with the uber-liberal ideological angle that men like Walter and, yes, even Richard, tend to hold to. They don't want people having too many kids, especially the poors, but they can't seem to help there with birth control and abortion clinics and discouraging family growth and sermonizing or demonizing big families. No, there has to be something even more. It's, again, all tied into fringe left talking points. Walter gives anecdotes about South American families with tons of kids and how, quote, the Pope encourages this in his ignorance, returning to an earlier conveyed kind of disdain for religion in Patty's sections, with a special animosity held for Catholicism. When this book was written or published back in 2010, and when this story is set in 2000 to 2005 for this scene, Walter's anecdote, and yes, I'm sure his Lalitha there, were much ballyhooed in environmentalist circles, as was his data. But as we know now in 2024, collapsing birth rates in many countries is actually hollowing out those nations whose people might engineer or create novel solutions to these challenges. But no, the Walters, Pattys, Richards, and Lalithas of the world refuse now, as they ever have and ever will, to want more unworthies to procreate in the future. They only want just enough drones to lord over in their future utopia, one they always seem keen to presume will see the wisdom of their rule and capitulate, if only they will hear their educated elite betters out. Franzen clearly knows or is one of these people, and the picture that he's trying to paint in this book of those folks is expertly crafted and, quite frankly, nauseating. An example of this is on page 616 when Walter says, "I did some breeding myself." Here, even Richard, a degenerate musician, finds Walter's terminology interesting. And on page 620, or screen 620, Walter says, "We want to make having babies more of an embarrassment, like smoking, like being obese." By this section's end, its title and header is concretely established as a superb piece of multiple entendre. Think about it, mountaintop removal. Richard Katz and his band found some small bit of widespread notoriety and success for Nameless Lake, the associated tour for which saw him a top musical success in the music world in his own way. He was on top of the mountain, as it were. And in a very different way, Walter has reached an elevated plane and reached the top of his mountain in the conservation field. But both of them have taken a fall from that mountain top. And Richard has plans for Patty, crudely conveyed in the allegorical design of using his dick as a kind of weather vane and divining rod. He fully intends to once again cuckold his supposed best friend. And now we're on to Womanland, Joey Berglund's section. The first couple of pages of this portion of the book really sort of buttress my sense from the book's first section, prior to Patty's autobiographical bits, of the kind of smug, sociopathically selfish person that Joey Berglund is. He resents the 9/11 terrorists, not for what they did in terms of taking innocent lives, or beginning the war on terror that was an awful response, but because they exposed him as clueless about world happenings. Like, buddy, what the fuck? The sun does not circle around you. Next note, a few pages into Joey's section, though, he strikes me as not necessarily sociopathic, but perhaps borderline psychopathic. But then later on, again, that he does display emotion. He is somewhat complex, but he's contradictory and all over the place. Connie Monahan had a long-running and unhealthy obsession with the boy. She's already damaged goods by this point. But this kid, dear God, he uses her and then sort of tosses her aside, or tries to. If not for Carol, Connie's mother, sort of spurging out on the phone at him and calling Joey out for the way that he uses people, how cold and calculated and detached he is. Quote, "When you were a baby, you hardly ever cried. You stubbed your toe and your face would wrinkle. That's a natural reaction, but you never made a sound." Page 677 through 681 in Kindle display. Dear Lord, Joey even actively and internally acknowledges that he trained Patty, his own mother, to back off of him and be less personal in their conversations. This kid, now in college, sure, but as a freshman, so still a kid as far as most adults would be concerned. This moment is another display of, this is just an unlikable piece of human flotsam. I'm also tired of the stepfather from next door, Blake, Connie's stepdad, being portrayed as some forgettable hayseed just because he's also clearly a conservative. It's downright stereotypical and hateful the way he is displayed and written. Even in third-person omniscient perspective, when it's not being a character, when it's not a character's thoughts being portrayed, relayed to the reader, he is described as a dunderhead, as a hick, as a dunce and a fool because of his worldview. So again, anyone who wants to just assume, well, you're assigning positions and perspectives to the author that aren't necessarily automatic. No, it's pretty obvious by this point if you've got any amount of reading comprehension skills. Franzen's disdain for such people is dripping off the page like gravy off of an overturned mound of mashed potatoes. Next note. Weeping for Patty after asking for money. Joey is a broken young man, period. He hates his mother. He acknowledges as much in his own head. And I think it's probably because she seems to have foisted all of her energy on him growing up, all of her attention and what affection she is capable of. I think he had a poor reaction to that. There are passages in Joey's middle stretch of this section, exchanges between himself and his girlfriend Connie that are grotesquely obscene and add nothing useful to the plot, the tone, or his character. They're just sort of titillation and cheap filler of a gross sort. Frankly, I don't understand why Franzen saw the need to have these bits in here. World building, character building details, sure, fine, but this was unnecessary. Screen displays 748 through 758. There's an oddment here, but it's kind of a good one. Joey seems to be waffling a little towards being a somewhat middle-of-the-road normal college kid in some ways. Yes, he is a bit of a degenerate, but there's something like a conscience finally budding up and being put on display, making him a lot more tolerable as a character around this juncture. I still don't trust it. I think his mother, Patty, really screwed him up. Still, there are several other facets of his overall person that are bothersome. Kudos to Franzen for having some kind of consistency, though, finally, with one of these characters, a moderate amount of growth. At this point, though, what I'm looking at is a beautifully formed statue of David that is not perhaps made of the best material. Something is off here. In the next section, the nice man's anger. Walter. Note 1. Right off the rip, Walter is cognizant of his own road rage issues, but he justifies this in his own head by acknowledging that it's an extension of his personal animus toward what he deems more deserving sources of his anger and hate. That does not bode well for him overall. The next note I've got. Holy hell, Walter has never had an alcoholic beverage, according to this exchange between him and Lalitha. I somewhat understand, given his father and older brother being alcoholics, but he thinks of them at this time, with Joey in college, as, quote, the banes of his youth, and he thinks of his wife, Patty, as the bane of his middle age. I was sat here thinking, man, hire a divorce lawyer if you're that miserable in life. Pull the fucking ripcord, buddy. But I think Walter may have a case of what is referred to as melancholia, wherein he feels most natural when he is miserable, annoyed, or angry. He needs some kind of impossible uphill battle to give his life a sense of meaning and direction. But it wasn't long after this, when I was about 3/4 of the way into Walter's section of the book, that I put it aside finally, and I said, I'm done. I'm out. This book for me is a did not finish. and here are my conclusions. According to Wikipedia, Goodreads, Amazon.com customer reviews rated 8 out of 10 and above, and archived critical reviews in the records vault of the American Library Association, Jonathan Franzen's 2010 novel Freedom stands head and shoulders above vast swaths of other books published in the 5 to 8 year window surrounding it. Oprah sang the book's praises and featured it for her book club. Barack Obama said he thought it was quite possibly the next great American novel of its time. Literary critics from The Guardian, The New York Times, USA Today, and the Seattle Intelligencer all hailed it as a, quote, masterwork. I'd like to know what brand and color of paint chips they were all eating like Totinos at a Super Bowl party to come to that conclusion. Barring that explanation, I'd have to posit that they were all asked about the book while sitting together in a townhouse with an aggressive gas leak. I try to remove personal politics and ideological considerations and biases when I sit down with a work of fiction, because viewing the world of a story's characters through their eyes and their perspectives is key to enjoying and appreciating a work of fiction. Indulging in fiction is also hugely influential in developing critical thinking, expanding one's imagination, and coming to appreciate life views other than one's own. With Franzen's Freedom, this is all but impossible, thanks to its principal cast of characters all, again, up to the point that I read, being dyed-in-the-wool, real-world liberal types or progressives in a tale set in our real world. Fans and supporters of the book will doubtless say things like, "You clearly didn't get the point, that this is a story about intergenerational trauma, and how people struggle to contend with their upbringings and innate tendencies hardwired at birth." Well, bucko, I did catch on to that, thanks. And the question that Franzen seems to be posing regarding freedom, as in, are we ever truly free to act as we wish, or should, given our genetic and familial backgrounds, our nature plus our nurture? The problem I chiefly have with the novel is not that it endeavors this highfalutin goal of making readers think on these things. Rather, it's that Franzen uses unsympathetic, unlikable characters completely and only, who are not quite three-dimensional, to do it. They are archetypes, and not even fully fleshed out or realized ones. None of them is what I would call a character in total by the halfway point of the book. You've got not a single character to latch onto as someone who is fully developed with a personal story that's worth anything. Moreover, their separate individual plot lines are relatively pedestrian, bordering on the cliched and trite, and all of them seem perfectly content to view the world through a only liberal lens, while painting the few small conservative characters or traditionalists that they interact with utter disdain, insult, and derision. Franzen writes these non-liberal characters as raging stereotypes in the unapologetic way that only a complete die-hard leftist would. In short, the principal cast sucks, the overall and contributory plot lines are uninteresting or unengaging, there are several degenerates who are painted as woe is he or woe is she, and the slant of the book's underlying themes and messaging is clear to anybody with any amount of analytical reading skills. Franzen's technique and mechanics are excellently pulled off. That is true. He knows how to deploy dialogue and descriptors of environments and characters in a very aesthetically pleasing way. Of that there is no doubt. And given the liberal/progressive bent, attitudes, and behaviors of the story's principal cast, it's really no surprise that the book was cheered on by the likes of NPR, Oprah, Obama, and their kith and kin. But for folks who are either middle of the road or slightly right of center, who do possess those analytical reading skills, this book is a steaming sculpture of David crafted from cow dung. Sure, it's gorgeously rendered, it has fine, detailed craftsmanship, but at the end of the day, it is little more than finely shaped shit. Jonathan Franzen's Freedom is a DNF for me. and I would not recommend it to anyone but the most absolute die-hard socio-political leftists. Even them, I would give a strong warning. This novel will not entertain you, because it is not actually engaging at all, unless you are yourself a degenerate. And that is my review of Jonathan Franzen's Freedom. Cheers.